I have another challenge for you. React Interview Challenge. Develop a React application that dynamically generates an interactive grid of boxes based on user input, ensuring the grid is symmetric. So instructions: provide a form with an input field and a create grid submit button. The user should input a single number to determine the dimensions of the grid. For example, 3 for a 3x3 grid, in other words, n squared. Each box should display a number from 1 to n squared, centered within the box. You should validate the user input and handle any invalid or empty inputs gracefully. When the user clicks on a box, the box should change its background color to blue, indicating that it is selected. If the user clicks on the same box again, the box should revert to its original background color, indicating that it is deselected. The user should be able to select multiple boxes at a time. There should be 2 buttons below the grid: reset and shuffle. The reset button should clear all the selections and restore the original order of the numbers in the grid. The shuffle button should randomly rearrange the numbers in the grid using the Fisher-Yates shuffle algorithm. The reset button should be disabled if there are no selections, and enabled otherwise. You can use the following TypeScript code to implement the Fisher-Yates shuffle algorithm. This function takes a 2-dimensional array of t as input and returns a shuffled copy of the array. And here's the function. Now, evaluation criteria. Your solution will be evaluated based on the following criteria: accurate implementation of the specified features and validation, clean and maintainable code structure, adhere to React best practices, proper utilization of state, event handling, and input validation, and lastly, efficient handling of dynamic regeneration based on user input. I just want to say that it's a little bit hard to find these challenges, so if you have a challenge, maybe you have been interviewed recently, please do not hesitate and comment down below with the challenge. I'll make sure to record a video solving that challenge. Anyway, let's start solving the challenge. So for this, if you want to code along, I bootstrapped this Vid Tailwind application so that you can just clone the repository in the description and you're good to go. So if I run the application and then open it up in my browser, as we can see, we have this simple counter. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, create the form with the input field and the create grid submit button. So I'm going to get rid of everything within this section, get rid of this state, and then create a form. This will have an onSubmit, and we're going to have the label, but before that, let me create the handle submit button. So event, this will not return anything, so mark it as void. And for now, let's just prevent default and pass in this function. Next, I'll render a label, and this will be, I believe it should be like grid or grid size, and then an input type number, minimum 1, and let's say maximum 100, this is fine. And if I save this and come here, as we can see, we have this very ugly form. So class name, then flex column, and if we do this, it should, well, this is inside a label, so this should come here instead. And if we do this, we get it like this. And then we can have a button type submit, and then create grid. And if I come here, we have this unstyled button. So what I'm going to do is come here under source, then create a components directory and create a file called button.tsx. And then I'll type props is equal to, and this will have children. And let's get rid of this and use an intersection. So react.html attributes, and we import React, and then we can say export const button is equal to react.forwardRef. and then we pass in the type, so HTML button element, and then the props, we get the children. And then what we can do is import the CN utility that comes with this project, and then we can add some styles and then pass in the class name so that we can add or extend from these base styles. And if I save this, come back here, we can now replace this with our custom styled button wrapper. And then we can say create grid. And for some reason, the type is not valid. Maybe it's the HTML attributes, I'm not sure. So let's say component props with ref, and we pass in button. And we can also get rid of these children because ultimately it will be within these props. So we can enclose this. And if we do this, you can actually pass children like this, like a property. So we can save this or make it more concise, and now it works. So if I save this and then come back here, we get this nice button. Now I'll not be styling the input, although what I could do, just as a quick solution, I could come here to chat.cn, come here over to input, and then manual installation, and I can just copy pretty much everything here. So I'll come here and say input tsx, paste it here, then fix this slint error, and then this will be in utils, I believe, cn. And with this, I can come here and replace this with this input wrapper. So if I save this, come back here, we now get a nice input field. Now we can add flex column, gap 2. So if I do this, it is now separated and it looks okay. Now, how can we handle the submission, so the state? Well, for this, we can set the name for the input to be grid. And then here we can say const form data is equal to new form data. And we pass in the current target, which is the form element itself. And then what I'm going to do is actually add sod so that we get some validation here. So we can say z dot, and then we can say number dot positive dot minimum 1, and we can also pass in the coerce. So it is going to try to coerce or parse the string or whatever that comes in into a number. So if we pass in this string, we get a number back. If it's invalid, then it is going to throw an error, basically. So with this, we can say const parse data, and then we can say save parse, and we pass in the form data, and we get the grid, because I believe this should be unknown. Well, it's a form data entry value or null, but it's not really known whether we will actually get something or not. And with this, we can now declare the size of the grid. So there are different approaches to this. We can create a state. So use a state and we set the size, and then we modify the size whenever the user wants to modify the grid. Or we could invoke a function that is going to generate the grid, and based on that generated grid, it is going to render the data. So both are valid, although I want to be a bit more explicit here. This is something that once I finish the project, we can look areas for improvement. But for now, I'll just say size and then set size. And then this will be a union, number or null, and we can initialize this to null. And with this, we can say if parsed data dot success, for some reason a typo here, parsed data dot success, then we can set the size to the parsed data dot data, which is of type number. And then we can render the grid itself. So I'm trying to think of the best way to render the grid. Should I define it within its own grid component, or is it okay to do it here? Now I'm thinking that it's maybe best if I create a grid component. That way we have a separation of concerns and also encapsulation, because if it's within its own component, we can define all the necessary functions to select and deselect a box and whatever else we're going to need in that component. If we do not create that component, we would be defining everything within the application component, which can get quite hard to maintain. So for that, I'll come here to components and I'll create a grid component. So grid.tsx, and then I can export const grid, which is a React.function component, and the props, we need the size. So size, which is of type number, then we pass in the props as a generic, and now we get full type safety. And for now, let's simply render a paragraph saying this is the grid component, and we pass in the size just to see if it works. And then what we can do is conditionally render the grid. So we can say if size is different from null, then we can render the grid and we pass in the size property. So if I save this and come back here, let's say it's going to be 3 squared. So this is the grid component. And if I change this to 2, it is going to re-render. And if I input an invalid value like this one, create grid, well, it's not going to work because I forgot we're also using this native validation here. Now, this could be potentially circumvented if the user edits or inspects the element and removes that attribute, but we're also validating it in the runtime. Although let's not be too pedantic about this. So now that we have this, we can create the grid. So we know it's a 2-dimensional array. So for that, I'll create a function, create matrix, then we pass in the size, number, and then it is going to return an array of arrays, so 2-dimensional of number. Now we could use Copilot, but I guess this depends a lot on whether the interviewer will allow you to use Copilot or not. Now someone reasonable nowadays would say, sure, go for it. Because after all, as I've said in previous videos, these tools are great. They're not going to replace your job, but it's going to make your life easier. So should I assume we get access to Copilot? If not, what I'm going to do is define the box. So before developing anything, we need an ID. So each box should be uniquely identified. We could use the number. So if it's 3 squared, we get 1 through 9. So 1 maps to the first box, that is the unique ID. But in a way, I feel like that could complicate things when shuffling the array, because we're shuffling based on the index, which is the unique identifier. So if we shuffle things up, so we shuffle the boxes, then the state will be preserved, but with the current position, if that makes sense. So for that, I'll create a type box, and this will be ID string, and then value of type number. So this will return a box instead. And for this, we can say const matrix. This will be an array, and this must satisfy a box, a 2-dimensional box. And we also need to keep track of the counter. So 1 through 9, we can say let counter is equal to 1, and then we can iterate. So from I is equal to 0 up until the size, and then we increment I by 1. And with this, we need to create the rows. So we have the columns, we're defining each column, but now we need to define the rows and append to that row this new box. So we can say const row, this satisfies a box, and then I guess this is fine. Although the ID, I would prefer to use our robust solution. So we can import, create ID. And what is that import? Create ID from CUID2. And we can invoke this function. And for some reason, I'm using satisfies. I've been using satisfies a lot lately. It's very powerful, but well, we're keeping the original type, which is an empty array, which in other words is a never array because it will never contain any elements. So it makes sense to use this one instead. Now we're getting an error here. ID does not exist in type box. And that is because this is not two-dimensional. This is a one-dimensional array. And here we get an slint error. So for this, we can say counter plus equals to 1. And then we push the matrix and we just return the matrix. So this is the whole logic for creating these two-dimensional boxes. And then we can store the boxes. So we can say const initial grid is equal to react.useMemo. So we're going to cache or memoize this matrix in such way that even if we update this state, so we set the selected boxes to something different, it is not going to rerun this function. Now, this is a way to prematurely, we could say that, optimize the application. But I guess this could be important if you have a grid that is 100 squared or something like that. So we can be safe and simply say only create the matrix whenever the size property changes. Otherwise, if it's exactly the same, keep the cached value. And then we can create the grid. So grid set grid, and we pass in the initial grid. So that is going to be the initial state. And then we're going to have the selected boxes, so selected IDs, and then set selected IDs. This will be an array, so let's say array of box at the ID property. So I like to use this instead of saying an array of string, and that is because we're synchronizing the type. So if I were to change this to a number instead, or perhaps an object for some reason, it is going to still be synchronized. So I would recommend doing this as much as possible. Realistically speaking, always do this. And now that we have the grid, let's just render each box. So for this, we can render a react.fragment. And then what we need to do is iterate over each row. We get access to each row. We render the parent that is going to house each element. And then we render each box individually. So it is a nested render. So in this case, we can say grid.map. We get each row and the row index. And then we render the housing div. So div, then the key will be the row index. And class name, we can say flex. No gap. We want to keep the boxes tightly close to each other. And now we can render each box. So we can say row.map. We get each box and we get the index of the box. Although I'm not sure if we need this index, but let's leave it like this for now. And we can render a button. We'll not be using the button we created because this is going to be more unique. So this will be type is equal to button. This is just for accessibility. You should always set a type for your button. And then the key will be the box.id. And then we can say class name. And for now, let's just say border. Then the border will be border, which again comes from the index. So if I type in border, we have this CSS variable. And then we can say a padding of 2, height 10, and width 10. And then we can pass in the box.value. And we're getting something here. I believe we're missing a parenthesis. And with this, same here, we should be able to save this. And if we type in something, as we can see, we get the grid. So if we type in 3, seems like it's stuck here. So 3, okay, now it worked. I'm not sure why. Okay, seems like we cannot change the size of the grid. So if I set it to 3, it works. And then if I try to change it to 2, it is not working. So what I'm going to do is try to debug this. So log the size and we get 2. So it is changing. Is it the memo? Is it this one that is not letting it change? Or is it the initial grid? Because we change this, okay, that makes sense. If we change the size, this will be recalculated. So it is going to invoke this function again. But now the grid itself is still the initial grid. Because, well, if the initial value changes, it is not going to recompute this line. So that's why it gets stuck with the previous value. So for this, I think that the best way to handle this is to simply move this to the parent. That way, instead of specifying the size, we can recompute, so we can invoke this function once again here in the parent, and then what we're actually passing down are the boxes. But I feel like that's going to complicate things when we want to mark them as selected and when we want to deselect them. So for that, I'll not do anything. Let's keep this bug. I'm not going to change this. Let's say, okay, if I create it with 3, it is going to be 3 no matter what. So let's just move on. Let's just add the logic for selecting and deselecting. So for this, we can create a function, toggle selected. We get the ID of the box and it is not going to return anything. And all we need to do, this is very basic. We just set the selected IDs. We get the previous values and then we check if the previous IDs includes the ID that we passed in, then we just filter it out. So where item ID is different from the one that we passed in. So this should actually be previous ID. And we return a new array passing in the new ID. That's pretty much it. So we can say onClick, and this is actually here. So onClick, and we simply say toggle selected, and we pass in the ID of the box. But now we need to show whether it's selected or not. So for that, I can come here and I can say cn, again for conditional styles, and then we can say is selected. So to get the value, whether it's selected or not, we can simply use this dot includes. So we can say selected IDs that includes the current box ID. If it does, then we can set the background to be primary. Otherwise, we can set it to, let's see how it looks like with transparent. And if I save this, we can now get rid of the second argument and then come here and click on the boxes. They are now marked. So this works beautifully. So now that we have this, we need to, okay, so let's make sure what we have done so far is correct. So provide a form, and this is centered in the box. They are centered, so this is perfect. And then when the user clicks on a box, the box should change its background color to blue. That works. And to deselect, that also works. And the user can indeed select multiple boxes at the same time. And then there should be 2 buttons. So reset and shuffle. The reset button should clear all the selections and restore the original order of the numbers in the grid. And then this shuffle button should randomly rearrange the numbers in the grid using the Fisher-Yates shuffle algorithm. And the reset button should be disabled if there are no selections. And I suppose if it's not shuffled, so if the shuffle is, or if the initial state is the same one as the current grid. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to be able to reset the grid. So for that, what we can do is first of all render the buttons. So div class name, then flex item center gap 2, and then we can render 2 separate buttons. So this will be a shuffle, and the other one will be a reset button. And for resetting, we can have it in line here. That's okay, because I believe it should only be one line, which is set the grid to the initial grid and reset the selected IDs. That's pretty much it. So if we do this, save this, and then come here and let's add some spacing. That looks much better, and the create grid should be separated with this one. So we can say margin bottom 4, we save this, now looking much better. And then if we select these ones and then click on reset, it is going to remove them. Now we can disable this. So we can say disabled if the selected IDs.length is equal to 0. So this is partially correct. So now if, so it's not showing it's refreshed or disabled. So for this, we can add disabled and then BG primary 50. So this better signifies that it is disabled. So if we come here and create a grid, as we can see, the reset is disabled. What about the shuffle? So if I come here, we have, you can use the following TypeScript code. So I'll come here over to utils and name this shuffle two-dimensional array.ts, then paste it here, shuffle to the array, and then we can come here to the grid, and upon click, we can set the grid to this shuffled array, and we pass in the previous grid because we should be able to reshuffle based on the last shuffle, although I don't think it really matters whether you pass in the initial grid or not, but just to make it clear, we can say set and then grid. We get the previous grid, and all we do is invoke this shuffle to the array and we pass in the previous one. And since this is using generics, so T, this is going to work just fine, and we should actually export this. And with this, we can import it. And now if I save this and then come here, select something, click on shuffle, as we can see, it is now getting shuffled. And if we unselect the 2 and the 3 and the 1, we can now shuffle it. I was wondering why is it not shuffling the columns? And that is because I copied over the array that is, or the function that only shuffles the rows and not the columns as well. So don't worry if you want to follow along, this will be updated in the repository, but this is the correct function. So now with this, if I save this and then come back here, check these two, now they are getting shuffled all across the two-dimensional array. Okay, so now what we need to do is, well, two things. First of all, if you shuffle the array, notice how I cannot reset the grid when you should be able to reset it since it's not equal to the initial state. And the other one is, well, fix the grid size error. So if I say 2, it's not working. So let's tackle each one by one. Let's do the reset one. So for that, we can come here over to the grid, and here where we have disabled, we can create a function that compares 2 to the arrays and then returns a boolean, true if they are the same, false otherwise. So we can say r to the arrays equal .ts, then export function r to the arrays equal, then this should be a, which is unknown. There's no need to know the data type, although we could use generics, but I guess it doesn't matter in this case, as long as, well, it is constrained to be a two-dimensional array, which is what we're doing right now. And then we can return a boolean. And for this, there are multiple ways to do this. You can use every, so you can say a.every, and then you get each row, and then you compare that with the other array. This is one solution, but the other solution, if you just want to quickly compare these two and you do not want to think about these algorithms right in the spot, especially in an interview, and if you do not have access to ChatGPT or even Google, in that case, what you could do is simply say JSON.stringify A is equal to JSON.stringify B. That way, it is now going to compare to strings instead, which is a quick, dirty solution. Now, I don't know about performance. I have no idea if Stringify could be potentially faster than this every. You would have to look that up. But for the purpose of demonstrating the solution, both are completely fine, to be honest. So with this, we can now come here to the grid and we can say disabled selected IDs.length is equal to 0 and the R to the array SQL we pass in the grid and initial grid. So if they are equal and there are no selected IDs, that means that we should not be able to reset it. So with this, if I save this and then come here and then refresh this just to make sure that it's the initial state, as we can see we have 1 through 9, and if I click shuffle we can reset it and it shuffles back again to the initial state basically. So now with that, how can we create a grid or recreate it when we change this? Notice how if we change this, the reset is now available, and that is because internally they are not the same. But well, it's not re-rendering, it's not doing anything, so we're seeing the previous state. So in that case, there are a couple of solutions. The first one that came to mind was move everything, all of this, so the grid, initial grid, all of that to the parent component. That way we can have more control, and then we can, on the parse data.success, reset it. So set the grid to the new grid that we pass in. That's one solution, but that's not ideal. And the reason is because you're now dumping everything in this app component. And after all, for separation of concerns, it's better to handle that here within this component. Now, you may think, hey, I can use a use effect. So I can say react.useEffect, you pass in the function, and then you say every time the size changes, we update the grid. That works, that's true. But if you check the official documentation, React, you might not need an effect. Here, they will say you do not need effects to transform data for rendering. So how can we do this then? Should we resort to the first solution? And the answer is no, because you can actually, and that's something I forgot initially, is you can set a key. So the key is not only a way for React to know in a dynamic list like this one, so it can identify which element belongs to what. It is also a way so that React renders a component based off that ID. So if the key changes, React will unmount and mount the component again. So it is going to re-render the component. That obviously entails the internal state to be lost in that re-render, but that's obviously what we need here. So for that, we can set the key to be the size. So every time the size changes, the grid will be re-rendered. And with that, if I save this, it should work. Let's try it out. If I say 2, changed. What about a 3? Now we have 3, a 4. And if I select all of these and then say 2, as you can see, it gets lost either way. And even if it didn't get lost for some reason, we're assigning unique CUIDs. And the chance of a collision, which means that it's the same ID as before, is so but so low that you'd probably never see it in 10 years of constantly doing this. So with that, I believe we have completed the challenge. So we implemented the algorithm, we have the 2 buttons, reset and shuffle, the box changes to another color, and we can deselect the box. We can also select multiple boxes, and we also have this form, which displays a grid from 1 to n squared. So now with this, I hope you learned a lot. Now again, as I said in the introduction, if you have challenges that you want me to complete, please comment down below. I'll be more than willing to solve those challenges for you guys. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one.